A report from The Economist shows that sex scenes, and yes, you heard me right, sex scenes. Oh, egad. Sex scenes in American films have declined 40%. That's a big percent. The way they kind of figure this out was they assembled a list of the 250 highest grossing films of each year, starting in 2000, and then kind of indexed which ones had sex scenes or sexual content or what have you, right? And films in 2023 had just over 60% of the erotic content found in the year 2000's top 250. In terms of like specific genres, action films saw a 70% decrease. So our action films are so much more sexless than they were maybe like in the 90s or the early 2000s, right? And romantic films, which did not have as big of a decrease, but still saw a 20% decrease. And the films with no sexual content jumped from 18% in 2000 to 46% in 2023. So this is a really interesting sea change. And it's weird because you would think that as we've become more comfortable with sex in movies and media, you would think that number would be going up. And in a sense, TV shows I feel like have way more sex now because, a lot more shows are on Netflix or HBO and they can be R-rated or X-rated or whatever they want to be. But this, I think, speaks to the kind of the puritanical relationship that we as Americans have with sex that, regardless of your religious affiliation, is just embedded in our country's, cultural and psychological identity, rooting back to the Puritans in the 17th century, right? Going back 400 years, America hates sex. But it loves violence, and that's always been the interesting thing about American movies is that, you can have a very violent movie, and it'll be like PG-13. And then a barely sexual movie that just has like a fairly sexually explicit scene will be R. Sometimes X. It'll be rated X, or now it's NC-17, right? And there are these stories where it'll be like something that is obviously sexually explicit, but it's not like pornography level. But movies talking about like, well, we had to cut this scene, otherwise they would give us NC-17 rating, which is a problem because the reason why the ratings matter is that movie theaters have all agreed like we will not show movies rated NC-17. So it completely torpedoes your movie if you can't get that R rating at least, right? But in America, we're more than happy to have violent scenes for children, violent movies for children to watch, again, being PG-13. And I think this makes sense though, because it speaks to, studios want these films to appeal to the lowest common denominator, right? So just in America, the more people can go see your movie, the more money you're going to make, right? So if it has more sexual content, it's going to be rated R or even just PG-13, and that's going to limit who can come see the movie, right? But in addition to that, even looking outside the United States, because we export a lot of our films to other markets, sexual content may prohibit international distribution in big money-making markets like China is like the big one, right? So that could cause problems, right, for the bottom line. And this is not just like, our movies are getting more moral or squeaky clean or whatever, because the report also shows that other vices, and it didn't list what vices those were necessarily, at least in like the, from what I was reading in terms of my research, though depiction of other vices are not declining at the same rate. So it's not just like all films are becoming a little more family friendly, like specifically sex. So again, there's a lot of reasons why this could be happening. Like I said, America hates sex but loves violence, so we're willing to have that trade-off. Another thing people always point to is like Gen Z Puritanism. Like you'll see a lot of time people like Gen Z kids, and I guess some of them now are just like adults. And I say this like I'm not Gen Z. I was born in 1997, so depending on what source you're reading, I'm either millennial or Gen Z. I consider myself a zillennial, which is a real thing. You can look it up where it's, again, it's kind of like elements of both of those generations. But in any case, you see a lot of commentary from Gen Z people online, especially like TikTok, talking about like, there's too much sex. Like, I don't want to see sex in movies or whatever. And like, there's this real pearl clutching kind of attitude that the younger generation has. So, So that could be also part of it, that, tastes have changed. But then also, honestly, I think the main reason for all this is just an increased sensitivity, which is a good thing, right? Filmmakers and producers have a better, and again, still, we've made progress, but most filmmakers and producers statistically are going to be men. But those men have a better understanding of how sex has been used in film to objectify women. So some filmmakers and producers maybe think twice about having a sex scene because at its core, it could be reinforcing the male gaze and, using women again as objects of sexual desire, as opposed to being like a scene of like two consenting adults sharing in something. This also tracks with like the rise of on-set intimacy coordinators. So like people making sure that, sex scenes are being done with like preparation and choreography and coordination. So that way, you don't have someone, like if someone's going to touch your butt, you want to know that. It shouldn't just be like, oh, it happened in the moment. Like that's something that should be choreographed the way like a fight scene is planned and choreographed. So that no one, in a fight scene, you make sure it's all choreographed so no one gets physically hurt. But I think with sex scenes, you need that choreography and coordination from an intimacy coordinator to make sure no one gets emotionally hurt or sexually hurt or psychologically hurt, right? Because you don't know what someone's triggers might be. You don't know what they might be comfortable with. So I think that also I think this all speaks to why sex scenes have declined so much in film. That people are just, whereas maybe back in the day, they would have just thrown in like a really cheap sex scene. I think now filmmakers, like if it's going to be in there, it's going to be like a sex scene. And have a lot of thought put into it. It's not just going to be like this kind of thrown together thing where it's like really focused on like a woman being really hot and sexy, right? So I'm not really against any of this. There is something to the idea of like, because Hollywood films were sexless for years, they had a lot more sexual tension, right? So, like the filmmakers got really good at like capturing sexuality implicitly. So like the way people look at each other or the way that you shoot a scene or edit a scene, it, really can capture the sexual tension and desire between two people. So like maybe we just need to like get good. You know what I mean? Like filmmakers just need to get better at that. And maybe they have. And there's ways, for example, like Challengers that just came out is a very sexy movie, but there's like no sex scene, right? So I think that's a great example of like sex being this thing that can be great subtext, but it's good we live in a society where it's not forced to just be subtext. It could be more explicit. And by explicit, I don't mean like sexually explicit, but just more like on the surface.